Hi, everyone. Welcome to the last of our lessons on historical thinking, or at least the last of the slideshows on historical thinking. We're going to continue on today with the last two elements of historical thinking, which will lead to an assess task for you. So let's kind of review where we've gone so far. We started early on with this idea of establishing historical significance. What makes it an important historical event? We moved on to talking about using primary source evidence. Historians use primary source evidence, and we sorted that out with you giving me some primary source evidence on your summer travel. Following that, last week we looked at two more elements of historical thinking. We looked at recognizing continuity and change. Okay, that was where the idea of turning points came in. Where do things change? Where do they stay the same? And what's important about that? And then finally, we moved on to understanding cause and consequence relationships. Okay, what impact do certain things in history have on the future? So we're going to take a look at two more today, which are related. Can be somewhat confusing, so we'll go over them here. The first one is this idea of taking historical perspectives. Okay, we have a habit which is perfectly natural, perfectly understanding, of judging past events through our ideas of today, of 2014. Okay? And a historian can't do that. A historian can't take history out of its context, out of its surroundings, and be judgmental about it. Okay? We have to be more clinical, we have to be more scientific, if you will, about things, and we have to take all the variables and factors into consideration. Okay? So historical events can't be looked at through the eyes of today. Okay? We can't time travel from 2014 to 1914 and make judgments about the decisions people have taken without understanding the context. There's lots of things that force people to do things in a certain way. There are social factors and cultural factors, intellectual and emotional influences that all have an impact on why things happen the way they do. We call those things put together, we call them the context of the situation. Okay? You know, those are the sort of the buts, if you will. Sometimes when you get in trouble for doing something that's quote unquote wrong, you will say, yes, I know it was wrong, but this happened and this happened that made me do that. That's the context of your situation. So we can't look at just the act itself, we need to look at the context. Okay, and to do that we have to consider all these factors. Okay, so when you start looking at history within context, we call it historical empathy. Okay? And historical empathy is when you take seriously views that are very different from your own. And taking them seriously doesn't mean you agree with them. And this is where we can get into lots of trouble. If we take a sort of unanimously unpopular event in history, something where people have been killed or massacred, or something that politically today we would think, think of colonization, and we have, we think of the early explorers arriving in America and the American Indian experience at the time. With today's eyes, we're very happy to say that was the wrong thing to do, but we're not looking at that in the context. So we don't have to agree with what was done, but we have to take seriously the views of the time. Okay? Think about segregation in the South. Here's an example for you. Up to the 1950s and 60s during the civil rights movement, many schools and government institutions and local businesses were segregated. African Americans could not use the same institutions as white people. Okay, so the federal government, in the 1950s, made a decision that all schools would be integrated, blacks and whites going to schools together. Mississippi and some other states resisted this, said it was the state's right to choose, and they weren't going to have integration in their state. Okay? How can we possibly empathize with that? Well, we can empathize with that as long as we know the difference between empathize and sympathize. Okay? And empathize is to see things from another person's point of view, whereas sympathy is to feel for that point of view, to feel bad for a person. Because this is just to empathize means to take a look from that perspective, to understand what the emotions involved are. Okay? So, what were the supporters of keeping schools segregated? Sorry, there's a word missing on the slide there. Were they evil people, or what's the context behind it? But, to explore the context, you have to think, what was their upbringing like? What kind of family were they raised in? What were their parents and grandparents telling them about black and white in American society? What were they being told by their government? The governor of the state of Mississippi stood up and said, no way under his watch were any schools going to be integrated in Mississippi. Okay? What might make them feel the way they did? Historically. What was life like in 1950s America? What were they afraid of? So what is it like to look through their eyes at the time? Am I saying that I sympathize with people who wanted to keep schools segregated in America? Absolutely not. But I want to understand why they wanted to make those decisions. And that's taking a historical perspective. That's what historical empathy is. Doesn't mean you're sympathizing. Doesn't mean you agree. Okay? It just means you're taking the perspective for intellectual purposes. This is a great quote from a study a while ago, 2005. If we treat people in the past as less than fully human and do not respond to those people's hopes and fears, we have hardly begun to understand what history is about. So to simply pronounce some people crazy or evil or bad or any of those things without stopping to consider the context and without stopping to consider they're a human being and they made a decision based on something, we're being lazy historians, really. Okay? We're being lazy. We're not really putting any intellectual effort into figuring something out. Okay? Now, having said all that, let's move on to the next element of historical thinking, okay, which goes kind of hand in hand with that, which is learning to understand the ethical dimensions of history. So this is related to historical empathy, and it's also related to cause and consequence, okay? While yes, we want to withhold our judgment on agents of the past and events of the past so that we can find out the facts. We do want to do that. We want to remain clinical. We want to take on historical perspectives. We want to find the facts. Okay? We don't want to approach it with our 2014 eyes, okay? With our modern context and thinking, so that we can find the facts. But there's going to be plenty of times when we're looking at history when we've found out that the facts are not pleasant facts, and these events have far-reaching consequences, and they were people acting irrationally or with malice or with bad intentions. And so what does that lead to today? Or even if they had good intentions but bad consequences. So what have these acts led to? What has something that happened 50 or 60 years ago led to today? What are the repercussions? And how should these people be judged now? And there's lots of examples of the past encroaching on modern life. Take a look at some of these. This idea of reparations, making up for past wrongs. If you look at things like slavery, do the descendants of slaves today, do they deserve something? Do they deserve some sort of break for something like that? Look at the Japanese who were interred during World War II in America after Pearl Harbor. Okay? What do they deserve for the time that they spent in these prison camps as American citizens? This idea of native schools or Indian schools, or the treatment of American Indians or Native North Americans in general. All over North America, Canada, and the States, they have treaty rights. I know in Canada, even the natives of today don't pay sales taxes on things, and this is a legacy for the way that even their ancestors were treated from more than 100 years ago. This idea of native schools where we took native children out of the reservation, out of the Indian reservations, and put them into white schools to whiten them, as it were. What's the cost of that? What do we owe people for that? This idea of national apologies for historical war crimes, the admission that what your country did, was wrong. Formal remembrances. This idea of war cemeteries, remembrance days. Every year there's always a controversy over Japanese politicians visiting a specific temple that honors its Japanese war dead, which seems like a good thing, unless you happen to be Korean or Chinese or somewhere where the Japanese army did a lot of damage in World War II. But most importantly, looking at things this way and understanding the ethical dimensions is really about learning. There's a very old adage that I'm sure you've heard, that those who don't learn history are doomed to repeat it. And that's really what looking at these is all about, is not repeating the mistakes of the past. How do we recognize these kinds of things? So there we go. Those are the last two elements of historical thinking. Okay? Taking historical perspectives and understanding the ethical dimensions of history. So now that we've gone through them all, and there's a couple of exercises this week on these, we'll start putting them all together as well, and we'll be looking at these all year long. We'll be looking at these 6 elements all year long. So great, there we go. Move on with the rest of your tasks for the week, and we'll talk again soon. Thanks.